Tahani Mustafa, who's a senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group. Appreciate you coming on, Tahani. When you kill more than 400 people, most of them, well, we don't know how many of them, but clearly most of them, if not all of them, civilians, including women and children, that is going to obliterate, as Hamas has said, that ends the ceasefire deal. Is there any way to somehow put this back together again and reconstitute some kind of peace and a ceasefire going forward?
Well, look, as far as Hamas is concerned, this doesn't signal necessarily the end of the ceasefire agreement or their willingness to enter into negotiations. What they're demanding is that the parameters of the January ceasefire need to be restored. What we have here is Israel, the adversary, that is insistent on unilaterally breaking that ceasefire deal, offering an undisclosed initiative that wasn't part of the original ceasefire, which is to extend the first phase in order to get all their hostages back without guaranteeing that there's not going to be a return to open warfare. And to do that, it is now trying to use military aggression on top of already the use of starvation as a weapon by cutting off all electricity, water, and aid to Gaza. It is now deploying military aggression with the backing of the US in order to put pressure on Hamas to agree to the extension of the first phase, which would see Israel see the release of its remaining hostages, but again, failing to guarantee or offering no guarantees that it will actually lead to any kind of permanent cessation of hostilities.
Seems like we're right back where we were before the ceasefire was agreed, with Israel bombing Gaza, people dying. As part of the negotiations to agree that ceasefire, there were guarantors. There was Egypt, there was Qatar. We're assuring this agreement. What role do they play as guarantors? Can they do anything?
Well, that was precisely the one of the fallacies of the agreement, of the original January agreement, which was the only two guarantors were the ones with the least leverage over Israel. You can have the Egyptians and the Qataris trying to ensure that Hamas acts in good faith. They have some kind of leverage over Hamas. They were able to pressure Hamas to accept many of the conditions that would have been, 6 months prior to that, unnegotiable for Hamas. The problem really, ultimately, is the stronger power to the conflict, which is Israel. And really there is where we needed the US guarantees, which we didn't see. If anything, what we saw was the Trump administration playing both sides of the fence, where they pressed Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire in January, while also then threatening Hamas to release more hostages during that first phase, threatening the expulsion of Gazans from Gaza, while also then contradictorily opening direct lines of channel to Hamas. So, really where the guarantees should have come from were not regional states. They don't have that kind of leverage. And that was exactly the kind of fallacies many of us were warning about.
Tahani, this is a question I asked on day one of the ceasefire being struck, because it seemed to me like a serious danger that once Israel, after phase one, had got most of the hostages returned, what was there to stop it just going back to the bombing? If it had most of what it wanted, what would stop it from doing that? And that's exactly what's happened. So was this always going to happen, or do you think that this was just an unforeseen development?
I mean, this was certainly expected. I think many had expected Israel to try and derail any substantive negotiations towards phase two. We'd already seen that after the first 16 days, where Israel had violated the terms of the original agreement, which was by the 16th day of the first phase, they would have to enter negotiations to start discussing the second phase. We'd seen over 1,000 violations during the first phase, on top of the failure to engage in talks around the second phase. But we'd also seen other violations, right? The use of gunfire, drones, airstrikes, the fact that Israel had rescinded on most of the humanitarian protocols agreed upon. So this really comes as no surprise, to the extent where even Hamas were expecting, right from the outset, I don't think Hamas were really expecting Israel to act in good faith, as they had failed to do so over the 16 months prior during negotiations from November 2023 onwards. And in that time, Hamas have managed to regroup, not just in terms of their own fighters, but also military capabilities, expecting something like this. And this was something that Hamas themselves had also warned about during the announcement of the ceasefire, which was, if Israel fails to act in good faith and resumes or somehow manages to derail the process and re-enters into open warfare, then Hamas will be ready to engage in continued insurgency, which it has been doing over the last 16 months.
Tahani, thank you very much. Tahani Mustafa, my guest. She's a senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group.